Hello, everybody, and welcome to What Would Your Ideal World Be? A podcast which examines very fascinating people, the topics that they care about, and most importantly, what their ideal world would be. If you like what you see here, please like, share, and subscribe. Robin Tilbrook is the chairman of the English Democrats political party, of which seeks a devolved parliament for England and has been since he founded the party in 2002. In this episode, in light of the party's 20th birthday, we will discuss the successes and failures of the English Democrats and what the party's future is. Tilbrook was a previous guest on the show in 2019. That episode will be linked down in the description below. Hello.
Hello, Edward.
How are we?
Well, all right.
Thank you for
I
coming
don't,
on.
I don't normally refer to myself in the as the royal we.
That's fine. Just glad to see you, and thanks for coming on once again.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Before we start, actually, I just wanted to give you a present, given the celebration today. I suppose you could try and blow it out, but I'll do it instead if you don't mind. I'll have that later. Anyway, thank you for coming on once again, and I'll just start if I may.
Yep.
Okay. Before I start, actually, if you don't mind, I want to give a quick tribute to Queen Elizabeth II, given I've been that long off the air pretty much. So, yeah, I've had the pleasure of being in her personal vicinity 3 times. It's been wonderful, and she's a great queen, and she'll be sorely missed. But on to the actual questions now. What do you think the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II will be?
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Obviously, one of the things that she's worked very hard at over the years was the Commonwealth, and that seemed to be a great success. And then we had the Black Lives Matter campaign, part of which has the agenda of saying that everything to do with the British Empire was awful, something to do with slavery or something to do with colonialism and taking people's property and land off them and destroying their cultures, rather ignoring the fact, of course, that quite a lot of the reason why there are black people in America is because of obviously of slavery, but the reason why white slave traders went to West Africa is because that's where the West Africans were rounding up their neighbours to sell them. Originally, sell them to the Arabs, of course, and they were rather pleased to get an alternative buyer who would then probably pay more than the Arabs were going to pay.
Mm-hmm.
And quite a lot of the reason why Africa wound up being colonized, so-called by British colonial power, was to suppress the slave trade. That's why Nigeria was taken, for example, and most of West Africa. The reason why Gordon was in Khartoum was because he was trying to suppress the slave trade at the other end, where Arab slavers had walked their chained gangs all the way across Africa to the Horn of Africa.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's very interesting. But admittedly, don't tell the makers of that film that came out, The Woman King, that because that film apparently celebrates slave traders. But never mind. What do you think then about recent reports concerning, if I'm not mistaken, the Daily Mail was the one to expose this, that apparently, well, one of the problems with the current coronation that's going to be taking place next year is the fact that India and a bunch of other countries have moaned about their royal jewels being in the crown and so on, and apparently that could upset trade deals and all the rest of this stuff. What do you make of that sort of attitude that these people have?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously it's a populist thing to say if you're an Indian politician. As a matter of fact, of course, the Kohinoor never belonged to India; it belonged to the Sikh kingdom, and the last Sikh prince, I think was. Well, they now say was bamboozled into it, but at any rate, I think he did actually give it to Queen Victoria.
So yeah, that's very interesting. And what do you think of like concerns about that about King Charles, as he's now known, King Charles III possibly being too political, especially given some of his like previous stuff about climate change and being
Black
such
Lives
a
Matter.
Yeah, well, yeah.
because
So
he was a big supporter of Black Lives Matter. He arranged for the Prince's Trust to give them a lot of money, and he's on record with that. He, as you say, with climate change, he's very much involved in trying to push for net zero, and he has been politically really quite active in terms of not party politics, but in terms of trying to change the way things work, and in particular his various sort of passions that he supports. I think the issue is that I mean we already partly saw this, didn't we? Because he wanted to go to the climate change conference in the Middle East, and he was also going to say something that would have been embarrassing to the government, and Liz Truss and co. Actually seems to have vetoed him going because as king he requires the permission of the prime minister and the cabinet to before he's allowed to travel abroad, and so I think that it'll probably be trouble in the long run. And the other thing he's doing is the very thing that every rookie teacher gets told, which is don't be nice to the kids for the first half term, because by the end of the half term, that first half term, you'll be seen as being weak and wet, and easily a good target for there to be riots within the classroom. So I mean, the nicer he's seeking to be in the early stages, the less authority in the long run he's likely to have, I would say. And I noticed there's also another controversy going on because he's trying to say that he wants a very slimmed down coronation. I mean, you get to a point where if you slim it down too much, then you almost wonder what the point of the monarchy is, because the monarchy is about pomp and circumstance.
mm,
If it's not going to provide pomp and circumstance, well, then what's the point of it?
mm. Yeah, I have family members who are teachers, so they could probably relate to that analogy a little bit earlier. But anyway, excuse me,
Well,
sorry.
I taught at one time, and that's what I was told, that you had to be nasty for the first half term. And then at the end of, but if you eased up in the second half of the first term, everybody think you were sort of firm but fair, or some other expression like that. Whereas if you didn't go in hard, you'd have the kids rioting in your class. In fact, when I was at school, the teacher came in and tried to be nice that first half term. By the end of the first term, kids were literally chucking raw eggs around in his classroom.
Okay.
And by the way, I saw him probably 10 years later at the same school, and he'd still got the reputation for being weak and having no discipline over the kids, and none took any notice of anything he said about it.
Anyway, on your actual party now, uh, the thing that, if I'm not mistaken, that initiated it was of devolution and stuff like that. And if I'm not mistaken, you started out as a Conservative Party member. What made you decide to leave and create an English nationalist party?
Well, it is true. I was a Conservative Party member. I think, like probably many Conservative Party members and supporters, certainly at the time, we tended to be a bit adrift on what Conservative Party at its core stood for. So, I mean, I would have, if you'd asked me when I was a Conservative Party member what it stood for, I'd probably said sort of patriotic, things like that. But of course, Conservative Party certainly since then has become more and more liberal in the modern sense rather than the traditional sense of the small state, the liberal and progressive values, that sort of thing, and multiculturalism. Those are the kind of values that you now get from the Conservative Party. It's no accident that Boris Johnson, during his last year as Prime Minister, had granted visas to over 1.1 million, 1.1 million applications. It's worth noting that a visa isn't for just one person necessarily.
Oh
It
wow.
could be for a whole family. So, you've got a minimum of 1.1 million people coming here, and very probably the thick end of 2 million, in fact. And that's in just 1 year. And that's very much conservative type thinking. Liz Truss has been saying she wants to increase the numbers coming through legal means, as they would put it. And of course, in the meanwhile, they're going to be able to do nothing whatsoever about controlling the illegal people coming in as well. So, I mean, that is where the Conservative Party is now. And certainly, I wouldn't want to be part of anything to do with that. I mean, it's just not my type of politics. And I think it's worth thinking about just where Liz Truss came from, because she was a Lib Dem. She was a Lib Dem that David Cameron poached along with a number of others. Most of those Lib Dem, well, several of those Lib Dems spun off over Brexit. So you could think of Anna Soubry or Heidi Alexander, and I'm sure you could come up with other names as well. Those Lib Dems were always Europhile. They're always been multiculturalist. They're pro identity politics and pro cancel culture, for that matter. They are really dishonest opponents of people who are patriotic, and they try and make out that they're patriotic. In fact, I've got a blog, and some years ago now, one of the former Conservative MPs, Matthew Parris, wrote an article in which he was boasting about the fact that when he was a Conservative MP, he would lie about supporting the death penalty in order to get himself selected and re-elected.
Wow.
And then whenever the death penalty came up as an issue, he always made sure to vote for it in principle. And then he would vote against every single, this is what he says, he would vote against every single way of implementing it. So that he would be part of basically sticking a spanner in the works so that it couldn't actually happen. I think that's actually very typical of the way that a lot of Conservative MPs operate. They are dishonest about what they stand for, and then when they're in, they don't do anything that's basically conservative in the way that they operate. That's a very long excuse for not being a member of the Conservative Party.
That's fine.
But I would regard myself as a patriot or a nationalist. I think those terms are very similar, and some people try to make a difference between those two, but I don't think there really is a difference. Of course, the sort of people that would want to make a difference are hoping that the left will be nice to them if they are one side or other of that divide. And that is a completely ridiculous attitude, because the left is never going to be nice to anybody who cares about the country or the nation. The left want to get rid of both concepts. I think you could probably do no worse than think of Congresswoman Ortega, I think her name is, and she was being interviewed, and this was in the last days of President Trump, and she said that it wasn't so much Trump's wall that was racist; it was the very idea of borders that was racist.
You're talking about Ocasio-Cortez, the New York, what borders are racist unless they're Ukraine's, obviously, in which case there's a huge distinction. I'm not sure what. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to ask you on that front was, what made you decide to start an English nationalist party in the English Democrats back in the early 2000s?
Yes, so I mean, what had happened was at that point we'd had the general election. Part of the issue that John Major tried to raise in it was that if Labour was going to do what it was promising to do, which was to have referenda in Scotland and Wales on setting up Scottish and Welsh parliaments. And if they were going to do that he said would start the breakup of the Union of the United Kingdom. Obviously the people voted for a government that intended to do that. I'm not sure huge numbers of people voted on that particular issue, but nevertheless, that was the effect. Blair and co then got to work on it, and we wound up with the Scottish and Welsh referenda. The Scottish referendum voted convincingly for a Scottish Parliament, and they got the Scottish Parliament, First Minister, and government. Worth bearing in mind. They also have still a Secretary of State who's part of the British government, and that Secretary of State is Secretary for Scotland. The Welsh voted just very narrowly for Welsh Parliament. The former English county in Wales, Monmouthshire, didn't vote for a Welsh Parliament, but they just went over the required threshold first time round, and they've got obviously a First Minister, a Welsh government, and the Synod, originally Assembly, moving more and more towards being a proper Parliament which has legislative powers, and there's a strong push within the Welsh legal system for separation from the English one, because there's an English and Welsh legal jurisdiction. And Scottish and Northern Irish one, they're all separate, but we may well shortly have a separate Welsh legal system. You know, all that was happening, and my thought was, well, what's happening for England? You know, why at that point, my question was, why aren't the Conservatives trying to do something for England? And you know, I lobbied my local MP, and I spoke to various other MPs that I came across. The interesting thing that I found, which opened my eyes a bit, was that they were saying things like, "Well, we shouldn't talk about England because that's going to undermine the Union, because the Union's more important than the idea of England." They were saying, whereas that I would be the opposite. I mean, I would think that England's more important than the Union, and I would always have thought that. And so I was surprised by that attitude initially, but I didn't realise at the time, I have to say, that the Conservatives had been actively trying to break England up into regions under Major, and to some extent, in previous Conservative governments. But you know, by the time Major left office, they had set up regional governance up to a point. I mean, it hadn't got any democratic legitimacy because nobody had ever been asked about it. They were just doing it as sort of bureaucratic executive decision making, and obviously Labour then took that up. They gerrymandered it a bit to give themselves two additional regions that would be permanently Labour, you know, the net effect was that we've got both British political parties having an agenda to break England up into regions. And you may remember when Gordon Brown was the Prime Minister, he would often refer to the nations and regions of Britain. Well, as far as he was concerned, the nations were Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which is a bit of an oddity because Northern Ireland's never been thought of as a nation. But the regions were what you and I might call England. Labour tried to get that through with a democratic mandate, and there was a referendum up in the northeast, and I worked with Neil Heron, who was the leading campaigner to try and prevent a mandate for the northeast region becoming a permanent fixture. And that was hugely successful because actually 79% of people voted against it.
Mhm.
So at that point, democratic regionalisation was dead in the water. They've tried it a couple more times with regional mayors, and then when those regional mayors have been rejected by the electorate, they've still gone ahead with setting some of them up.
Mm.
And where we are now is that basically the only reason that regionalisation hasn't been imposed on England by the British political elite is because they can't agree where the boundaries should be. Because there's no history of regionalisation in England, so there's no sort of cultural or community basis in which you could produce regions. England's to the extent that it's divided, it's been divided along the lines of counties.
Mm.
And one of the reasons why the Labour push for a region in the northeast was doomed was because they reckoned that Newcastle was going to be the headquarters for that, and that's where the regional assembly was going to be. As soon as everybody else in the northeast area realised that, they were absolutely determined never to be Geordies. and that was the end of it, really.
Fair enough. And funny enough, that leads on to another question I wanted to ask you on that front, which was why do you feel that English devolution specifically was ignored by the Blair government at that time? You've already sort of somewhat answered it, but is there any other specific sort of reasons? Or
so I think many people I talk to don't really understand the extent to which Blair and Brown and his government were quite far left in some ways. They were very identity politics rather than old style communist. I'm saying they were that. But nevertheless, there is the legacy of the fact that communists and Karl Marx in particular were thinking that England was the biggest stumbling block to revolution. In fact, Karl Marx once said, rather sort of wistfully, that all the revolutions of Europe were wrecked on the rocks of England. I think there was always a hostility to the idea of England, and you sort of see this, don't you, whenever the BBC or other mainstream media produce a program about England or mentioning England in the title, you can be pretty sure straight away it's going to be an attack on everything to do with being English and England itself. So I do think the left still do hate the idea of England, and it's been quite interesting watching the former cabinet minister John Denham, who's now a professor at Southampton University with a department which is called the Centre for the Study of. Actually, I've messed up what the title is, but it's something like the Centre for English Identity and Politics. And because he's dared to mention England, even though he's actually quite multiculturalist about what England should be, he's still wound up being pilloried by many in the left because they loathe the idea of England. In fact, you don't have to be very far left to get into that. So, I mean, when Charles Kennedy was the leader of the Liberal Democrats, and Brown and Blair were pushing English regionalisation, he said that he supported regionalisation because, he said, it was calling into question the idea of England itself.
indeed, and why do you think why do you think there is such seeming like anti-English hostility among the establishment beyond just sort of left-wing politics? Because as what I remember, there's also several things like from Hollywood that are imported, which are very anti-English, most notably two very significant Mel Gibson movies, those being The Braveheart and The Patriot, which The latter accused the English of committing essentially Nazi-esque war crimes during the American Revolution. Why do you think there is such, or in Trainspotting, for instance, where essentially they infer that the English are an inferior race? Why do you think there is such, beyond the sort of just left-wing reasons, hostility among the elite to the idea of England and Englishness? Is it because, like, unlike possibly Scottish nationalism, it's not linked to an idea of being progressive? So, for instance, when Emily Thornberry or whatever it is goes to take a picture of that person in Rochester, I think it was, of the white van man with the England flag, she finds it a bit peculiar. So why is it that they're so hostile to it just beyond left wing politicking?
Well, one of the oddities. Let me sort of. I have to. It's a bit of a sort of question that has to be unpacked. I think one of the oddities of, shall we call it, Celtic nationalism, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, is that all three of their nationalist parties have been penetrated and taken over by far left activists. So let me just give you the example of Nicola Sturgeon and what she said. She did an interview probably about, I don't know about you, but I find time's flown rather with the lockdown. So when you think something's 2 years ago, it's 3 years and so on.
Mm.
So I should think it was at least 3 years ago, maybe 4 now. But she was interviewed about the Scottish National Party, and she said that she was embarrassed that her party got the word national in it. Because that's not her politics, she was saying. And when she was interviewed as part of the leadership debates in the 2019 general election, she said her vision for Scotland was to be an independent, internationalist country within the EU. So I don't know about you, but I wouldn't consider that somebody that said that qualifies as being a nationalist.
No.
That person who says something like that is basically a left-wing internationalist. And that's exactly what she is, in my view. Alex Salmond made a great mistake appointing her as his successor, because Alex Salmond was somebody who wasn't an ideological far left activist. He was far too intelligent to be that. But what he was doing was he was trying to destroy Labour and the Liberal Democrats in the same way as predecessor leaders of the Scottish National Party had destroyed the Conservatives. And at the time when they were trying to destroy the Conservatives, the Scottish National Party were often called the Tartan Tories. But whilst they were trying to destroy Labour and Liberal Democrats, they positioned themselves as being left-wingers, which obviously Nicola Sturgeon, who is a left-winger, was very comfortable with. And Salmond obviously didn't study her carefully enough, either on the question of her politics or on the question of how vicious and vindictive she would be if he suggested that he might want to come back into politics. Because I do feel that whole series of accusations against him were simply cooked up in order to sabotage him coming back into politics. And obviously he was acquitted of all those things, so clearly the court system thought it was wrong. But I don't think we'll ever really fully get to the bottom of exactly what role Nicola Sturgeon had in setting all that up. But it looks pretty fishy, shall we say?
Indeed, it does.
And you didn't even laugh at me when saying it looked fishy when we were dealing with Salmond and Sturgeon.
Hey, I didn't even yeah, me having not particularly good sense of humor at some points, I suppose.
Okay. I'm not sure I've answered why Hollywood is against us. I think the answer is that Hollywood has been very much taken over by left-wing multiculturalist activists, and you've really got to see any of them talking about things or look at a current Disney production, and you can immediately see all sorts of bizarre things going on that you wouldn't rate as being part of any sort of traditional mindset, let alone something as traditional as the idea of Englishness.
Mm.
England is, well, one historian said rather grandiosely that England was the God's firstborn amongst the nations of the earth, because we are actually the oldest nation on earth, and we were united at the end of a century of struggle to become united. We united on the 12th of July, 927. And if you compare that with, say, Italy, Italy came into existence as a united country in 1863. In Germany, 1871. You know, European nation states are not very old in most respects. The exception being England, which is very old.
I was gonna, yeah. Before I move on to the next question, actually, I was gonna say when you're talking about Disney and a lot of their remakes and stuff, and they're pushing agendas and saying, thank goodness you didn't mention Netflix because there's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, I just have a bit of a go. I think, in terms of your initial success, your party received much media attention at the time in the early 2000s, have high-profile celebrities supporting it, including Robert Kilroy Smith, and had a small but growing membership base. Explain how such success came to such a young party as yours was back then in the early 2000s.
Well, I don't know if we did have what I would describe as success. I mean, we have had some people elected, but we haven't had very many elected. I do think we have had an influence on the discussion about England, and I never meet any politician who doesn't know about us and hasn't thought about what we're trying to say. So, I mean, I think we've had an influence on the discussion. You've got to bear in mind that politics is to some extent a discussion, and if you think about what happens when you have a group talking about something, if there's nobody talking about one particular thing, that thing simply gets forgotten in the discussion. It doesn't get remembered, and that's also true in debates and arguments. But if there is somebody arguing for it, even if they don't succeed in winning the argument, they still influence the way that the argument actually occurs. And I think we've been quite successful in that. We've also been successful in campaigning for England to have a future and the English nation. And part of that has been that we have actually now distributed, I should think, at least 50 million leaflets. So we have kept people thinking about England, and we did get some media attention, like you say. Part of that was because of the then rules of the BBC showed that if you stood across the whole of England, as we did in the first EU election that occurred after we launched, and you got a certain proportion of votes, then they had to give you some coverage. And we stood across England. We got about 250,000 votes first time round. And Robert Kilroy Silk at that point was in the throes of, after that, was in the throes of falling out with Nigel Farage and UKIP. And it is true that there was some talk of him coming across to us. But in fact, of course, he went off and founded Veritas in the end, which didn't go anywhere. I think he made a mistake in that, because I think if he had come to us, he would have found that actually we were able, we had a platform that could have gone somewhere with somebody like Robert Silk. But what we've been left with, of course, is that in the early 2010s, UKIP became more effective at campaigning. They don't want to blow my trumpet too much, but they did actually follow some advice that I gave them, which I thought I still think it's it was good advice, and it obviously worked well. I said that they were only campaigning on constitutional issues at that time. They were up until 2010. They only talked about that they were trying to get out of the EU, and that they would talk about how bad the EU was in terms of its constitution, in terms of its politics, in terms of the type of decisions it was making. All of that was perfectly okay, but it was not something that was going to get the man in the street talking about. So I suggested that what they should do is link that to immigration. Because obviously one of the things that the EU was doing was stopping British politicians from fully deciding what our immigration policy was going to be. And there had also been, during the Blair era, a huge surge in numbers coming from Eastern Europe. Once they started doing that, they became the party that people were thinking was going to make the difference. Of course, they did make a difference, because we got the EU referendum, and then because you got the UKIP group, and you also got the Conservative group campaigning, that covered a much broader swathe of public opinion than any one of them would have done. But once we've got the EU out of the way, I always thought that what will then start to happen is that people will be able to see that it was actually the British political establishment that are absolutely useless and are damaging the country, and have been for years, of course. I do feel that we're rather seeing that with Liz Truss and co. I mean, part of the reason why people she had no, as they call it, a bounce when she was first won the prime ministership, was because you can't have looked at the Conservative Party since 2010 and seen that many people who have any talent.
Mm.
And certainly they are regularly coming up with supposed leaders who you probably wouldn't put in charge of a checkout counter. But they've got the title, and they're supposed to get and run the country. Of course, Liz Truss, as I said earlier, she's basically a Lib Dem, and she's trying to run Lib Dem policies.
Mm. And also was on David Cameron's A-list as well, which might, give some illumination to stuff. Yeah. Anyway, on electoral success, as you were talking about earlier, in 2009, you had your greatest electoral success to date, when Peter Davis became the mayor of Doncaster in the local elections.
Yes.
In 2013, he later left the party for several reasons, citing in his words, this is his words, a big influx of new members joining for the British National Party. So what initially went right and then so horribly wrong in the case of Peter Davis, if you don't mind detailing?
So Peter looked like he was a suitable candidate who would be genuinely trying to advance English nationalism, English democracy. As far as I could see, I didn't know at the time that he was being a bit sort of flighty about what he was prepared to do in the election. But we had an EU election and the mayoral election at the same time. So we used that to make sure that he was in the booklet, and also we did a full leaflet drop using the free leaflet drop system that you get if you're standing in a parliamentary election. The net result was that we were in the top two. And in those days, mayor elections were on a supplementary vote system. And what that meant was that the second preferences would come through. And he won on second preferences. That seemed like a great success. Obviously, electorally, it was a great success. He was never really prepared to work with us once he was elected. He started to think immediately, despite having never previously got anywhere near getting elected, that it was all him, and nothing to do with us. And he just wouldn't work with us particularly. He listened to Labour councillors doing what Labour councillors would generally do if you get somebody elected like that, which is basically try and persuade the person that what he needed to do was drop the party in order to become the mayor that everybody could support. And eventually he did drop the party. The issue he chose was the fact that at the time the BNP was dissolving, and some people joined us. I mean, not many, to be perfectly honest, but some. They were saying to us that they were really English nationalists anyway. I didn't really see any reason why we should say that none of them could join. I just think that was more of an excuse than anything else. But in any case, his excuse didn't work very well for him, because when it came to the next election, if he'd been an English Democrat when he was standing, he would certainly have won easily, because our combined vote was more than enough for him to win. But because he stood as an independent, he lost the position, and Labour got what they intended to get in the first place, which was to win the mayoralty back. So it's an unfortunate missed opportunity. I don't, looking back, I don't think there's anything that we could have done to make any difference to that. But it's just unfortunate. I think it happened. He got elected before the UKIP surge, but UKIP's now more or less gone from the political scene. The whole question of Brexit is no longer front and centre, and we're about to enter another phase where the question about England is becoming more important, because what may well happen at the next general election. I mean, at the moment, of course, everybody's getting hysterical about where Truss's figures are in terms of opinion polls. But by January 2025, when the next election has to take place, the Conservatives may well have rallied a bit. And what may then happen is the quite likely outcome will be that Labour will be the bigger party, but it won't be big enough on its own to form the government. And therefore it will need the SNP, Plaid Cymru, and possibly Sinn Féin to get over the threshold to become the government. And of course, those parties will require a price, which will be the dissolution, or steps towards the dissolution of the United Kingdom.
And funny enough, that leads very well into my next question, which is in an article, 2014 article for the New Statesman, it blamed the partial electoral decline for your party due to the rise of the much more successful UKIP, as you've already touched on. And given that UKIP, as you also noted, is in decline currently, is this a new sort of golden age for sort of parties like yours, sort of more nationalistic flavour of politics? Is it more just, golden era, perhaps? Are we leading to that?
We are the only party that's English nationalist. There's a very small party that's about the Constitution, but I don't see, I think that's man in the street's not going to be wanting to talk about Constitution. They want to talk about how that affects their lives, and what impact that has on the important questions, like, for instance, controlling immigration, as we've already been talking about. But there are many other things. I mean, we English subsidise Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, probably to the tune of about 60 billion a year at the moment. And whenever there's a capital project, like, for instance, HS2, we've got to cough up another 20 billion to as part of the so-called Barnett consequentials, for them to spend on capital projects when they haven't even got anything that they want to spend it on. So the system as it stands at the moment, if you're looking at it from an English perspective, is grossly unfair. It doesn't give a proper voice to England. We pay for everything, and we don't. We all we get really, as I've said from time to time, we get the bill and the blame. So something should be done for England, and of course, when you can see that the SNP are doing things, particularly for Scotland, and Wales has got its own government as well, doing something different for Wales, and in Northern Ireland, they seem to be moving more and more towards the point where there will be a unification of Ireland. For instance, obviously, we've got the majority party now being Sinn Féin there in Northern Ireland. They did extremely well in the south in the last general election. In fact, they might well have formed a government in the south if they'd stood enough candidates, but they hadn't. And only a few weeks ago, the National Statistics Office was saying that the majority in Northern Ireland has now become Catholic. So that all looks like moving towards the union with the South. In addition, one of the things that Boris Johnson's government did was the Northern Ireland Protocol has, according to the High Court in Belfast, impliedly repealed part of the Act of Union. So the Conservatives have already started the process of dissolving the union, and I think that is going to be, what one of the things that we're going to become more and more aware of, and people are going to become more and more likely to ask the question, well, what happens for England? And the more people start to think about that, the more they're going to be thinking that they need to support an English nationalist party.
And on that front as well, is your party currently one calling for independence or devolution? Because when I was looking into this, sometimes it's a bit confusing, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, oh dear. The reason it might be confusing is because for the first 15 years of our existence, thereabouts, we did campaign for an English First Minister, government, and Parliament with at least the same powers as Scottish ones. And partly because we could see that the British political establishment wanted to break up England, we could see that in effect the question was becoming, is England broken up or is the United Kingdom broken up? And obviously we don't want England broken up. So therefore, you can't really mess around with something like that. You've got to be looking at independence. And the other thing about calling for independence is obviously a much simpler thing to talk about. It's it's a sort of clean break type of approach, rather than having another English Parliament. People probably got a bit fed up with the way Parliament actually operates over the last 10 to 15 years anyway, not only the expenses scandal, but the whole Remainer attempt to undermine the Brexit vote. And I think the attacks that we were getting were things along the lines of England's too big. It can't have its own parliament. I mean, completely absurd, but that was the attack. Another one was any question to which the answer is more politicians is the wrong question. And obviously we weren't actually saying that there should be more politicians. What we were saying was that the roles should be changed and we should have an English Parliament for all English internal matters. But what you're then talking about is you're having to explain yourself. You don't get on to talking about what positive things we ought to be doing. if you're spending all your time explaining the complexities of your proposals to have an English Parliament. So, for several reasons, including I think most of us had sort of moved gradually to the idea that we really wanted English independence rather than anything else. We went over to English independence as our primary policy. I don't think you can fault that from a nationalist point of view. I mean, it's a sort of fundamental, really, that nations ought to rule themselves. And obviously, the United Kingdom was created as part of the whole drive towards empire, and in particular to fight the French. Hopefully, we're not going to do that again anytime soon. So therefore, we can focus on things that would actually be good for England.
And on that front as well, what do you make of prominent Conservative commentator Peter Hitchens' support for English independence in a recent Mail on Sunday column that he wrote? And do you think that speaks to a further push to the mainstream your ideas or ideas like it?
So when I was first in communication with Peter Hitchens, the best part of 20 years ago about this, he was definitely on the side of maintaining the union. But I think he's always thought of himself as being an Englishman in a way, even when he was at his most unionist. And of course, once you start to think about that, you see all sorts of things that say, well, actually, it's not fair. Why are the English the only people that pay prescription charges? In Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, it's free. And who pays for that? Well, it's English taxpayers. Just to take one example out of many that one could take. And I think he's basically come over to the idea that actually probably it's better if England were to be independent. I don't think he's sort of actively saying we should be campaigning for that. He's saying that that should be one of the options that people will think about.
And
could I just say one other thing though?
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Because a similar thought process went with Professor Sir Roger Scruton. So at one time, Roger Scruton would have said he's English, but he would have supported the Union. But some years before he died, he did a BBC broadcast in which he came out for English independence. So, it's a well-trodden path. It's not a unique thing that Peter Hitchens has done.
And the next question I wanted to ask you is that more recently, your party, bravely in my view, was one of the first to challenge, both in print and legally, the coronavirus lockdowns. Given the rampant inflation and mental health crises, among many others that they have caused, it seems, do you feel that morbidly you have been vindicated?
Definitely. I'm absolutely certain of it. And I thought it was very interesting, that admission in the European Parliament the other day by a Pfizer executive who admitted that they had never thought that the Pfizer jab would stop reinfection. And therefore the whole justification for quite a lot of the lockdown, and certainly the whole justification for vaccine passports and exclusions of the unvaccinated from various sort of public space. The whole justification for that has evaporated. There's no basis for that at all. I think what we're really seeing from an economic point of view with the whole sort of mess with the mini budget and everything else, is actually the impact of 2 years of lockdown. You've got to bear in mind it's not only just the 2 years of lockdown, it's also we've had 10 years or more of so-called quantitative easing. In other words, printing vast numbers of notes, of banknotes. The amount of money in circulation has been steadily going up. And it's really basic economics that if you increase the supply of something, but you don't increase, so you don't change demand or any other factors, but you just increase supply, what you get is inflation. Because the price of things goes down. So the price of money is going down. That means it's worth less and less. That is inflation. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised if we wind up with a really big dose of it. There's no use the Bank of England messing around with changing interest rates, because it's not interest rates that have caused the problem. It's the Bank of England and government printing notes.
Mm.
And during lockdown, billions of extra notes were basically put into circulation. We're seeing some of the consequences of that. And of course, we also damaged our supply chains and our economy. So those things are not going to be easy to reconstruct. And they probably won't be reconstructed, because at the same time, but bear in mind that on the sort of geopolitical stage, you've got other actors like China, for example, and indeed Russia, of course, that are not in favour of allowing Western countries, and in particular Britain, to carry on, as they see it, freeloading and getting cheap raw materials. So the whole situation, economically and politically, has changed.
And the next question I wanted to ask you is that, again, on the English Democrats specifically, is that what have so far been the biggest successes and failures you feel that the English Democrats have gone through as a party, and how has that shaped it as an organisation throughout the years?
Well, obviously, our biggest success was getting Peter Davis elected, and we also got some other councillors elected at the same time. But I'm not sure in terms of failures. We obviously the main point is we needed to keep going, and we have managed to do that. I think we've got a track record that I feel quite proud of. But obviously I'd like to do better. And I suppose if you push me for a failure, it's only that we haven't done better. But we intend to keep trying.
Fair enough. And what is it on that point? What does the future hold for the English Democrats in terms of electoral stuff and so on?
So I think it was interesting in the Essex Police Commissioner elections. I got 43,000 votes across Essex. That was a lot more than our opponents were happy with. And in fact, the BBC locally, the reporter was sort of squeaking rather when he saw how many votes we'd got. And that was just first preference votes. So in our experience, we generally find that you get at least double second preference. So we may well have wound up getting 100,000 votes or more across Essex. I think what we've been doing is we've been increasing our name recognition, and also getting people thinking about that people ought to be supporting a party that stands up for England. I think it's one of those things where you push and you push, and then suddenly you make a breakthrough. And I think it's worth sort of comparing what happened with the SNP, because they were founded before the Second World War in about I think from memory 1929. They never really achieved very much until suddenly they made a breakthrough at Glasgow Govan by-election in the early 70s. The candidate got elected, Margaret MacDonald, wasn't particularly good candidate, and she caused no end of trouble for the leadership of the SNP. She was actually even more trouble than Peter Davis was. But nevertheless, what happened was, because she'd won a by-election and it sort of sent shockwaves throughout Scottish politics, people then thought, it's not a wasted vote to vote SNP. And at the next general election, I think they got 8 MPs elected. And they have been getting MPs elected ever since. And of course, now they get almost all Scotland's MPs. At the next general election, Nicola Sturgeon's once certainly going to be saying that the general election is a vote for independence.
And before I continue on to my final question, actually, on the Police and Crime Commissioner, actually, members of my family did vote for you. Anyway, the final question I wanted to ask you was, it's a bit more of a pretentious question, so forgive me. Finally, in the 1990s, political scientist Samuel Huntington argued that post the Cold War, the main area of conflict and politicking in much of the Western world and beyond would be those of nation and culture, something that can be seen with several Western countries with various separatist and nationalist movements doing well electorally. Why do you think that is the case, and would it be fair to label the English Democrats as part of that phenomenon?
I think so, but there's also another point. What we've got is what the left don't like to call cultural Marxism, and they've got the 3 Fs they're attacking: faith, flag, family. That's what they're attacking, and obviously, none of the establishment parties want to stand up for any of those, and that does leave a gaping hole in terms of the spectrum of politics that is not currently being represented. I think the English Democrats will be that party.
Mm-hmm. And that's a nice conclusion to the interview. But before we go, if people wanted to find out more about you and more about your party, where can they find you? What's your social media handle, all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, so we're obviously got a website, which is englishdemocrats.party. We've got at English Democrat on Twitter, my Twitter is at Robin Tilbrook. I think we've got several pages on Facebook if people want to find us on Facebook, which are English Democrats, putting England first. So we are out there, and we are actively campaigning, and we're obviously looking forward to next May's local elections and some mayoral elections next May. And we need to get ourselves ready to fight the next general election in December and January 2024, 2025.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for coming on once again. Happy 20th birthday to your party, and have a good day to you.
Thank you, Edward.
That's all right. Thanks for watching. If you like that and want to see more, please like and subscribe, as well as share. For longer episodes of the show with exclusive content, check out the audio versions of these podcasts, which are linked in the description below. If you would like to recommend guests, as well as get some other exclusive perks related to the show, please consider subscribing to both my Patreon and or subscribe to Scarlet accounts, as linked in the description below as well. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good day.